Are you navigating a life transition? Could it be connected to the movement of the planets? Welcome to a new episode of the Harvest Series podcast in the spirit of Kaplankaya, where the Harvest Summit will unfold this May. We dive into conversation that inspire growth. Today, I'm speaking with Caggie Dunlop, creative entrepreneur, writer, musician, and host of the podcast Saturn Returns. Together, we'll explore astrology, life transitions, and how understanding cosmic cycles can bring clarity and meaning to our personal journeys. Let's dive in. Hello, Caggie.
Hi, Rose. Thank you for that introduction.
Thanks for being in the podcast and to let the technology magic happens between us.
You think that as a podcaster, doing it for 4 years, that I'd be more technical, but no, it's just not who I am as a person. It's always quite chaotic, so I apologize for that start.
All we need is your smile and all your insights about the planet and life transitions. So you're in London right now?
I'm in London, yes.
Good.
It's home for me.
Good. So can you explain me first, and for the people listening or watching us, what is Saturn Returns first?
Yeah, absolutely. So your Saturn return is something that happens astrologically in your late 20s, around 29 and a half years. Saturn returns to the same place in the sky it was when you were born. And within the realms of astrology, this is viewed as your cosmic coming of age, because Saturn as a planet is very much associated with karma, restriction, boundaries, discipline. So we often face a lot of tough life lessons during this time and have a sense of our own identity. Are we on the right path? Are we with the right people? Are we doing the right thing? And often everything can come crumbling down. And so it feels like a very tumultuous period in people's lives. And I decided through my own Saturn return experience to dedicate my work to this transition because I felt like it was such a pivotal time in my life that nobody was really talking about. And so I wanted to create resources for people that were navigating their own times of change.
Okay, I'm going definitely to ask about your Saturn return later, but why is Saturn more important for you than other planets? I know a friend of mine told me that Pluto had just moved to Aquarius. It was the first move since 2008. I think he told me like it's closing an important chapter. So what's the difference between all the planets, and why are you so, is Saturn more important for you than the others, or not?
That's a good question. I guess it has played more of a crucial role in my life, although I feel like that's shifting now because of my Saturn return, because I felt like that was in a way something that brought me back home to myself. I was always a very spiritual person, very much into philosophy. Astrology was something that kind of came into the mix a bit later, but I just became very fascinated with Saturn. But I've met so many different astrologers from doing the podcast and writing the book, and they all have the same experience. For them, when they discover astrology, it's like they're relearning a language that they already knew somewhere. Whereas for me, I do find it can be incredibly vast and overwhelming. And I quite like using astrology as a tool for personal development and introspection and self-discovery, as opposed to being a practicing astrologer myself.
So I understand the difference, and that you're not like an astrologist, but since you read a lot and you talk to so many people, can you explain me how astrology works? As a teenager, I was passionate about the horoscope in the magazine, especially in the love section. I guess astrology is way more than this. And so can you explain me what you learned about astrology?
Of course. So I think, similar to me, growing up, astrology was viewed as this sort of charlatan's practice, and it was watered down horoscopes in a magazine that whatever star sign you read felt applicable to you. So it didn't really hold as much value as it used to, and I'd say as it does today. Historically, astrology and astronomy were one of the same, and they sort of got disentangled from each other, and astrology became more of a naysayer's kind of practice that was dismissed, and astronomy became more valuable, scientific. But actually, it's always been used as sort of a mapping and understanding of the sky, the correlation between what's going on in ourselves and the cosmos. So as an individual, of course, we have things going on collectively, which are going to influence all of us, like big shifts that are happening. And then more personally, you have your birth chart, which will be a snapshot of what the alignment of the planets was at the time of your birth. And this is kind of like your blueprint for life. It will tell you a lot about your personality, about your purpose, about stuff that you're going to struggle with. It will also tell you about who you might be more compatible with, aspects of yourself that you need to work on. So at the moment, you know, we mentioned that Saturn was, I guess, my favorite planet, but I've been particularly interested in Chiron recently because that's where you have your wounding, an aspect of yourself that you might have a blind spot, but actually, if you don't address it, it can drive your behavior in a way that could, I don't know, stop you from achieving what you're supposed to in this life. So I find it a really interesting tool to kind of recognize that rather than things being wrong with you, they're just perhaps obstacles that you need to pay attention to and overcome.
People can be skeptical about astrology because there is no, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no formal science behind astrology. So how do you explain or how do you address to people being a bit skeptical why you like astrology? And for example, I guess some people might tell you, oh, does it mean that two twins are facing the same challenges because they're born the same day and the planet will align exactly the same?
Mm-hmm. For the people that are skeptical about it, because I meet quite a few.
I'm sure.
But then at the same time, I meet people that see a huge amount of value in it. And there are many ways that we could argue it, but I would say most importantly is if something has meaning to someone, then it matters and that makes it valid. So if it allows people to feel more seen and understood in what they're navigating and less alone, I think that is personally enough. But if we wanted to go more deeply into it, as I said earlier, it was considered a very serious practice historically, and it then became discarded as something that was woo-woo and not to be taken so seriously. So I think we're in this transitional period where there's the hangover of the sort of mystic Meg horoscopes and newspaper articles, but actually reclaiming the depth and knowledge that astrology can bring not only to us as individuals, but as a collective.
What did you like? You mentioned your journey regarding astrology and starting to know a bit more about this. What did you like first, and what was your journey?
So when I was in my late 20s, when I was about 27, I suddenly felt like I was going through a bit of a life transition. I had left London. I was living in LA. I was pursuing music at the time, and I'd sort of left a life in a way that I had spent a long time building in social circles, and I was on a trajectory that felt misaligned, but I really struggled to reconcile with why. And so I felt like I'd spent most of my 20s, if not as well my teen years, creating this version of myself that needed to fit in, to be liked and loved, and was kind of like this, a bit of a party girl. I got a lot of validation from kind of going out and knowing everybody. And then at 27, suddenly all those coping strategies started disintegrating and I felt this crumbling, but I really had lost touch with the essence of what made me me in many ways. I'd sort of discarded it. And I would say that was the more melancholic, philosophical, deep thinking part of myself that for some reason I just decided wasn't cool. And it was during that time where I started to find myself in different circles. And I never saw it as a career, but I would be invited to women's circles or a full moon ritual because in LA, you know, at the time that was happening. It wasn't happening in London. It is now. And I found a lot of grounding in that. It kind of brought me home to myself. And then I was connected with, well, we weren't connected actually. She just sent me a message on Instagram with this astrologer called Nora. And at the time I was putting out music and I was enjoying what I was doing, but I still felt like it wasn't quite it. And when I was in LA, someone had told me that I was about to go through my Saturn return, and that's why I was feeling the way that I was feeling. And I just became hooked on that idea. I was like, everyone should know about this. Researching it, looking into it, and I wanted to do something with Saturn return. I thought I wanted to make it into a TV show, as everyone in LA does. And so I started writing down these ideas, and I'd have all these notes. And then, like many of my projects, I sort of put it to one side and thought, oh, I'm never going to do anything with this. Cut to a few years later, connected with this astrologer who started telling me about my chart. And this was literally just a random person on the internet that I would have these conversations with about my chart, about Saturn return, about what I was going through. And I just felt really seen and really understood, and it just excited me. And she said, you know, you should do something like during this time. And I said, funny enough, I had this idea called Saturn return, and now I'm going through it. Perhaps there's something here I can connect. And then I was told by a bunch of different people that I should do a podcast, and it just felt natural that that would be the podcast. And I'd kind of gone through the other side at that point. I went through a very rough breakup. Those years were very tumultuous from 27 to 30. And I think a lot of people relate to that. We had this idea that everything is going to be filed into some kind of meaning, and we know who we are and what we're supposed to be doing. And I think rarely is that the case. And so it was a really beautiful thing to come out the other side with this blank canvas in a way, but to do something that felt very aligned with who I was at that moment.
Wow. So you mentioned the reactions. Were you amazed by so many people listening to your podcast and going through what you went through? And what do you think you learned along the way with your podcast?
I never actually went into it being fearful that people wouldn't like it, which is good because I am very fearful with a lot of stuff like putting out music or worried what people think. I was very lucky in that during that moment in time, we were going through the pandemic, and I recognized that that was a very difficult time for everybody. But because of the nature of the show being about people struggling during life transitions, and then we go into a pandemic, everyone was struggling during a life transition. You know, people was looking for resources to call upon because all the structure had disappeared, and they were at home. They were furloughed, which is what we called it here when people weren't working. They literally had their walk and a podcast to listen to. And so it really lent itself to that moment in time. And that's when we developed the sort of core of the audience. And still to this day, I have people that come up to me and say, you know, your podcast really helped me during that time, which is really lovely. And then in terms of what I've learned, so I think at the beginning, I was very much felt like a student in it all. So I was sort of finding people to speak to that could kind of help me on what I was experiencing. And that's actually been one of the most beautiful things about the podcast. It's like creating a brand out of learning yourself in real time. And that also allows people to come on the journey with you, because when it's two experts talking about something, it might be very interesting, but to the listener that's, you know, walking their dog, they don't feel necessarily part of that experience. Whereas I think the beauty is to make people feel like they are part of the conversation. So the most impactful episodes that I've had personally and that have gone down the best are the ones that have caught me at a vulnerable moment, not something that I've planned or would have wanted to happen, that they just captured something. And I happened to be speaking with someone that was perfect for what I had gone through a few days before. And you can't plan that sort of stuff. And because of the vulnerability and the sort of rawness of those episodes, that is the ones that our audience have liked the most.
What's the most vulnerable thing that you shared in your podcast and maybe you were not planning to share?
So I think I used to share a lot more. I used to forget that I was recording a podcast, because you do when it's like this, it feels so intimate, and that's the beauty of them. But there was one episode where I had been listening to this podcast by this man called Mark Groves, who has a podcast called Create the Love. And he'd helped me through the breakup that I went through during my Saturn return. I would listen to his podcast every day. He was going through a breakup at the time, and he would share his experiences, and it just felt like therapy. And anyway, I became a massive fan of his. And then someone else connected me with him to have him on my show, which for me was like, it was like Michael Jackson. It was like the biggest deal ever. Anyway, so I had organized to have this interview with him. It had been moved around because of schedules a couple of times, and it was during the pandemic. And I was dating someone at the time who it had ended 3 days before this podcast recording. And this guy, Mark Groves, is a relationship expert. So I was like, don't ask him about your situation. Make it, general and be professional. And then he started observing that I would laugh when I was uncomfortable. And he didn't do it in a mean way. He just noticed it. And as soon as he noticed it, I noticed it. And it was very disarming. And then he started asking me more questions. And it was just the most beautiful experience of someone really holding space. Like I felt very safe, even though it was a podcast recording, but I was aware that I could control when it came out or whatever. And the more he started asking me stuff, then suddenly I felt my voice just go, and I started crying, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm crying to Mark Groves. And he was asking about the situation that had just ended, but it was just really, really healing and really beautiful. And he was able to hold space for me in that moment, and to say, because he was like, what, your sadness or your experience right now doesn't threaten me. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, because but I can hold you in it. And he was just giving this language that was very, very,
comforting.
It was very it was very masculine, but it was very comforting, and it was like the opposite of what I had just experienced. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to kind of like have that conversation, and afterwards just feel so much better. Like everything just kind of made sense. And I didn't release that episode for a while, because I also think whilst being vulnerable and authentic and sharing your story is important, there's a real balance between I don't know what the word for it is, but when you're just sort of exposing yourself without really processing it, it can be a dangerous thing. But when it went out, I had a very beautiful response, and people loved that one, but I didn't expect to go there. I haven't listened since. I would be mortified, I think, if I listened back. But we became very good friends since that day. So yeah, I'll always remember that one very, very fondly.
Oh, that's funny, because it reminds me, I think my first episode for Harvest series was the second one with Gabor Maté.
Yeah.
And I didn't know much about him. And
it's probably for the best.
And then he asked me, I asked him, like, what's compassionate inquiry? And then he started to analyze me and ask me how my childhood was. And I was telling things about why I was drinking, and I was like, he says, why do you drink? And I was like, oh, I'm not drinking so much. Like, yeah, but why do you do it? And I cut it.
You should have kept it in.
Oh, come on. It was my second episode for Harvest series. I had to cut it. But it's somewhere.
That's what people love, though.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the beauty of having these conversations, it's like, it is kind of like therapy.
It is. It is. True. So, and you have your Saturn return around 27 to 30, you said?
So 29 and a half years, but you have this kind of shadow period after, and you have a progressed lunar return before, which is kind of challenging in its own way, more emotionally. But then your Saturn return is over a 3-year period.
So it's happening at your 29?
Yes, but you'll feel it.
Yeah, it starts moving before.
Yeah, exactly. You'll kind of feel it coming. So I'd say the period where most people are listening, and it's, you know, our audience is 27 to early 30s. And I think that's a really relatable transitional period, regardless of your belief in astrology.
Yeah. That's when I moved. I moved to London. I left Paris and moved to London alone at 28. So I can relate to that. I can find my Saturn returns. Yeah, totally. And so if you don't, can it happen? Because you interviewed a lot of people. Can it happen? You listen to yourself moving to LA. I probably listen to myself moving to London. Can it happen that some people don't listen to their Saturn call and then it explodes later?
Yes. And this is something that I am increasingly aware of because of the work. So basically, you have Saturn squares and oppositions. So your Saturn return, 29 and a half years. So Saturn to do its full orbit takes that amount of time. That is the big cosmic coming of age. We'll then have another one as we approach 60, as it does another orbit, which brings with it its own changes and transition. It's a bit more about legacy. What am I going to be leaving behind? And then if you're very lucky, you know, you have a third as you approach 90. However, within that, we also have, Saturn has 7-year, I guess, cycles, because each time it kind of does a quarter of its turn, we have an opposition or a square. So if you look back at your life from 7, 14, 21, up until your Saturn return and so on and so forth, you can see these initiations as we are kind of pushed into adulthood, and we have a sense of our own authority and autonomy, but we're sort of have this friction with other authority figures outside of ourselves. So like, I guess 14 is a great one because we're going through adolescence. We think we're adult, we're not. And we're often like going up against our parents because we're suddenly like we want more independence from them. Then 21, we also are like, we're adults, we know what we're doing and like get it all wrong. So if you continue that on past your Saturn return, let's say you don't listen to the nudges and you just sort of stay where you are, or you disregard them, you then have another opportunity to listen down the line. So you have your Saturn maturation. So I'm now 35. So I'm kind of like going into that next moment, and then continues on every 7 years. So that's when people have like, you know, midlife crisis. What point does that happen? When people suddenly, and it's usually around that age where people suddenly like, I haven't been living a life true to myself. To everyone from the outside, it looks very random. And they're like, why is so-and-so just bought like a Porsche and like skateboarding? Like, do you know what I mean? But it's people suddenly being like, I didn't do that thing, or I haven't lived a life true to myself. And so they suddenly push against whatever is around them. And that can have pretty dire consequences. But yeah, it goes to show it's not just one initiation.
Do you have some structured advice for people going through transitions?
I think what we tend to do, which can be useful, but it also can be very problematic, is as human beings, we will be so in the intellect and so in the mind that we can rationalize and reason our way through pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And we will seek advice from those around us without really recognizing if they live a life that we want to live. And also with the world that I'm in, there is a tendency to lean too heavily into esoteric healers and practitioners and psychics and tarot readers and astrologers. And every time we're subcontracting our own authority onto other people. And I think it's better to own your regrets than to listen to other people and go against your intuition and then essentially regret it anyway, if that makes sense. It's like, if you do what feels true and right for you in that moment and it all goes to shit, at least you can own that regret. Whereas I think we're so afraid of making a mistake that we tend to stay in the status quo and just do what everyone else is doing because there's a safety in that. But also it's an entrapment in its own way.
Yeah, totally. And what's your advice? Because you're someone quite spiritual. You've practiced, I guess, lots of things in LA and in London now. So what's your journey to be able to connect to yourself and to be able to listen to yourself and stopping the noise in the brain sometime?
I find it very hard. I've got a very, very active, busy mind, but I would say that they're nothing too complex. It's limiting the amount of time that we're distracting ourselves. I think we're all addicted to distracting ourselves on our phone, on TV. It's limitless. And it just means that we're constantly drowning out that intuitive knowing because we're not giving ourselves the moment to tune into it. Being out on our own in nature, going for walks, leaving your phone behind, honestly sounds really simple, but it can be so profound. Even if you're someone that feels like you're super anxious. I've had moments where I'm like, oh my God, I feel so anxious. I don't know what to do. And then I'll go out and I'll go for a walk and I'll leave my phone and immediately the anxiety is gone because it's so connected with this thing that we think is an extension of us. And that's incredibly unhealthy. And then the thing that is probably the most bizarre is that I feel like I have a good relationship with my spirit guides. And so I believe that we all have spirit guides that are sort of helping us navigate life. And I often tune in with them when I'm really feeling like I don't know what to do, where to go. Should I go in this direction? Should I go in that direction? And that has been really interesting because they will give me signs or symbols or feelings. And it often doesn't make any sense to me. And there's almost like there's a lightness in the way I communicate with them or the way they communicate with me. Because it feels like, we take everything very seriously. And like when I'm actually in tune with them, it's like, they're not taking it very, but there's a lightness to it. There's a playfulness, which I think we could all connect with a bit more. It's like, none of it really matters as much as we think it does. If we were able to zoom out enough. So just play and just kind of go with it.
Wow, cool. How did you? I wanted to ask you a question, but you can tell me if it's not something you want to talk about. But how did you navigate your transition after being a star in the show Made in Chelsea? Maybe this is a chapter you don't want to talk about, or
I don't mind talking about it.
Okay.
No, I'm fine talking about it now with certain people, but at the time, so that was very much. Who I was on that show was probably exactly who I thought I wanted to be in my teen years. So growing up as a teenager that would go to her room and write poetry and felt like a bit of a weirdo. Then suddenly I was asked to do this TV show about this group of people in London. And it kind of it wasn't a clear yes for me that I wanted to do something like that at the time. I just sort of fell into it and I did have a lot of fun. It was very fun for a moment in time, but we were catapulted into this sort of other world. It was bizarre. It was really, and it was very instant. And I didn't have any anchoring for who I was as a person. I think reality TV brings with it, fast fame has a lot of consequences. It has a lot of exciting stuff, but, something that goes up that quickly tends to come back down. And I always had that sense of feeling like something was going to go very wrong.
Okay.
I don't know whether that was necessarily valid all the time, but I think in myself, I was internally in a lot of turmoil. Didn't know who I was as a person. I felt this version of myself that existed on TV that was slightly manufactured, was sort of overshadowing whoever I really was. And that felt very scary because it was a sort of a caricature, of me. And I'd read about me and I'd be like, that's not me, but it became bigger than me. And so I think the decision to leave was a very challenging one, but it was something that was just purely on my own intuition. And I for a while I was like, what did I do leaving? Because of course, when I left, there was this, and I write about it in the Saturn Returns book, of this moment of self-inflicted exile where you have left who you used to be and you've outgrown that version of you. You don't quite yet know who you're becoming. Mm-hmm. And so you don't really have the friendships, you don't have the language, you don't have the support, you don't have the system. And it's really scary and it's really easy to just go back. And I would always look back at, people that were still doing the show and the stuff that they were achieving. And I was like, oh God, what did I do and where am I going? But now I can see, and like everyone has these experiences that suddenly through hindsight, you recognize how necessary things were, even if they were incredibly painful. Often it's the most painful ones that lead us to who we're supposed to become.
Wow, I think that's very brave that you left a certain fame. You could have like another path, like if you had stayed. Yeah. And and you went deep into being yourself and alignment. So well done. That's
thanks. I don't know. I often think, who would I have been had I stayed?
You mentioned at some point that you started a sober, curious journey.
Yeah, so I was about to say I would probably have been in and out of rehab a few times had I stayed on the show. And I don't mean to sort of, belittle that experience because, sorry, you were saying about the sober curious journey because that was a big one.
Are you still doing it or no?
So yes, because the thing I love about Sober Curious is when I was 27, one of the main things that I started to recognize in myself was like, okay, I am not good with alcohol. I'm really not good with alcohol. And it was getting worse. So I gave up then, but I would give up in this way that I'd go completely teetotal and I'd be really extreme. And then I'd go out and I wouldn't go out. But then if I did go out, I'd completely go mad and like wouldn't come home for like 2 days. And it was like complete chaos. So I just felt really like, God, I have zero self-control. And that was a really big part of my journey when I discovered the term sober curious, which was coined by a woman called Ruby Warrington. And she did a podcast on it, a whole podcast series. And I remember binging the podcast series, no pun intended, and really feeling like, okay, there is this whole group of people out there that have a difficult relationship with alcohol, because I didn't relate to AA, but I didn't relate to like normal drinking.
Okay.
But this opened up my world to like a whole spectrum of people that land at different points. And so I was like, okay, well, that I can get on board with. And it just allowed me to like loosen my grip on the sort of totality of it, you know, being like completely sober or trying to do normal drinking. And for a few years, I was not drinking. And then in the last year, and I feel like I could say this on this podcast because I'm sure, I'm definitely not the first. But a year ago or a year and a half ago, I had a psilocybin ceremony and it was very intense. I had no agenda going into it to do with anything with alcohol. At that point, I was still like, pretty much people associated me as someone that didn't drink. Very occasionally I'd have like a glass of champagne if it was a special occasion. But after the psilocybin ceremony, I remember like a couple of weeks later, I was in the south of France and I was like, I feel like a glass of wine. And everyone was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, where's this going to go? And then I like had it and then it was fine. Didn't feel that bad. And then since it's kind of continued where I don't know what it rewired, but it's allowed me to have a much healthier relationship with alcohol since.
That's cool.
Which is really cool because I remember some friends would say to me, they were like, oh, I'm sure there'll come a point where you'll be able to just like enjoy a glass of wine. And I just remember thinking, I don't know if I will. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do that. But actually I can now. And is really nice. And I really empathize with anyone that is on that journey in terms of addressing their relationship with alcohol because it is so tough.
Wow. And do you think it's because of the psilocybin, thanks to the psilocybin, that you've probably healed something?
I don't think you can bypass the work and just go straight to doing a psilocybin ceremony, but I think that it's a combination of, 5 years of remaining anchored in one version of me. Because the thing is, it's like, how are you using alcohol to enhance the moment or escape the moment?
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's very hard to determine which one. You have to really check in with yourself. And for me, it would sometimes start as enhance the moment. And then suddenly I'd be like, I want to escape the moment. And I would just go to oblivion. Whereas because and also because I used to use it as a sort of means of shape shifting, it was be whoever you need to be to fit in. And alcohol allows you to do that. But I definitely had, and I don't think everyone has this sort of switch that my, nearest and dearest will still say to this day. Yeah, it was like the lights are on, nobody's home. Like your eyes just suddenly go. And to people that don't know me that well, they'd be like, she's so much fun and this is great.
Yeah.
But it was almost like I was possessed. Like I wouldn't really have any recollection of what had happened. And that was quite scary. So yeah, I guess it's sort of been a combination of probably 5 years of remaining true to one version of me. And of course we grow and evolve, but I haven't felt a need to escape my own skin. And also doing all the work from the podcast, doing a lot of conversations around Sober Curious and really addressing that part of myself and just developing that self-awareness piece, because I don't think I'm not naive enough to say, oh, it's like completely vanished. I'm sure if life suddenly got really difficult and I turned out like it could be problematic. But like I said, I find that check-in of like, am I wanting to enhance the moment or escape it is always quite useful. And also another really useful tool that I used more during the time of going sober or sober curious was if I went to a party or something that made me feel uncomfortable and I had that social anxiety of like, oh my God, a drink could make me feel so much better. Everyone's drinking, like everyone's having a good time. I'd always tell myself, I'm like, okay, like the short-term pleasure of drinking right now, what is the long-term pain? And equally, the short-term pain of remaining sober and being super uncomfortable, perhaps going home quite early on your own and just feeling like a bit of a loser. But then the long-term pleasure of waking up going, wow, I actually, I did what I needed to do for me. And once I had enough of those victories, I was like, okay, this feels really, really good. And I had enough muscle memory to be like, yeah, no, I can abstain now. And that was really powerful. So it's like, I say, investing in tomorrow's you.
Yeah. Wow. That's a very, very cool journey, Caggie. Thanks for sharing it. And
Thank you very much for having me.
I like no your wine journey. I think is
Oh, that, yeah.
yeah, your for your I don't know if it's wine or alcohol, but I think it's
The wine journey. I love it.
I think it's a very, yeah. Thanks for sharing it because it's not like if one day you decide something and you become, you're still navigating, keeping it under control, and you're, yeah, progressing into your relationship. And I find it, you keep growing. That's beautiful
Oh, thank
and
you.
very nice. I've heard that you are doing the podcast will be released beginning of next year, so 2025. But we're recording in December. But I've heard you were doing a mood board.
Yes. A mood
So how
board.
do you do that? Do you have little advice for people who'd like to do a mood board?
Like a vision board for the
A
year.
vision board, yeah.
So yeah, I think they're quite nice to do. Although I would also argue that we set ourselves up with way too many expectations in January, whereas it's really a time to kind of go inward and plant seeds, but don't put too much pressure on yourself. But vision boards are a nice way of kind of putting down what you want to achieve, what you want to prioritize and call into your life. And I also find it really useful just to have a word for the year. So
Okay.
this year, my word has been creativity.
Okay.
And next year, I haven't actually told anyone this. So the year that this will come out, this is going to sound really weird. But I think I want my word of the year to be bitch.
Bitch?
Yes.
In
Because
2026, you mean?
no, 2025.
So you have
2024 was creativity. So I put out this like
ah,
courage to create podcast series. I put
okay.
out some music. I was really using that as like my way of navigating the year because I just was like, I need to be more creative. Whereas 2025, I think I want it to be bitch because I think as
How do you
women,
spell it? Sorry, because I'm French. I'm not sure about it. B-I. Oh,
B-I-T, no,
yeah,
not
right.
beach, not beach, B-I-T-C-H, like a bit, like a bitchy woman because, and I don't mean bitchy woman, like, you know, I think as women we're always told to be like the good girl and be the nice girl and always be polite and like never express anger or rage. And I realized that there's actually quite a lot of rage in me. And so I'm like, I want to be a bitch and be okay with being a, and I'm not saying I'm going to go around and be horrible to people, but just like be okay with being in that energy of not being liked all the time. Like that
Yeah.
is okay, you
Okay.
know?
So
Yeah.
no people pleasing for
No people
2025.
pleasing.
Yeah,
No.
good.
Because also in running my own business, like I've really noticed it doesn't serve, and it's mainly in the context of that. Like for me being a bit too, I don't know, I feel like people take advantage sometimes. And so I've noticed when I am a little bit more angry or a bit more forceful, people take notes. I'm like, okay, that's what we're going to be doing this year.
Be careful, people.
Yeah, watch
Don't
out,
mess up with
world.
Caggie. I saw you twice at Harvest. You've been, I think, in May last year and the year before. What's your experience there, and what did you enjoy most?
Well, I feel like it's evolved so much in the times that I've been there. And last year, definitely with Esther Perel was Esther. Am I saying it right? Right. For me, again, like she is exceptional. And I think her work and contribution, and she's got so much star quality. So hearing her speak, especially, I think it was just by chance that someone actually couldn't come. They had to like cancel, and she stepped in to do a second workshop, which was very interactive. And it was just the audience kind of asking questions. And the way she handled that was just she was so boundaried and so professional, but so funny and witty. And she really showed that she knows her stuff because she just could do it off the cuff. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And it was really
Yeah,
fun. So that
maybe.
was probably my highlight.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to ask you the harvest of the day because next May for harvest is going to be all about courage. And I wanted to ask you, when was the time you shared already some moments? So maybe you're going to be out of courageous moments, but what was a moment in your life where professionally or personally you had to show the most courage?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of this year being about creativity, I did put out a podcast series called The Courage to Create, because I feel like expressing ourselves creatively takes a lot of courage, because it's usually the parts of ourselves that we feel most vulnerable in, that we really crave and desire being seen in, and yet we will hide that away from the world for most of our lives often. So I think courage and creativity go very much hand in hand. It's like, what aspects of yourself do you yearn to express but shy away from? Because I feel like the more we do that and exercise that trust muscle and expand that comfort zone, the better we feel. And we tend to live in a world at the moment, I think, that is very comfortable.
And what is the aspect of yourself that you think you want to share more to the world?
Poetry. My most vulnerable aspect of myself is both poetry and music. And funnily enough, you know, people often ask like, oh, well, how do I find that part of myself? It's like, go back into childhood. Like, what were you doing then? And I was always singing, always doing poetry, but very introspective. I do it on my own. I didn't want anyone to know about it. And I've noticed like when I do share those aspects of myself, I feel most me. And I also believe that you can be celebrated by the world for a lie and it will not feel very good. But if you can be celebrated by a few for your truth, it will feel fantastic. And you only need like a handful of people to recognize you and congratulate you, and that's enough. So yeah, I want to share more of my creativity. I've done a bit, but I could do better.
Good waiting for you. Thank you so much, Caggie, for sharing all of this and for this podcast. And I hope to see you in May about courage.
Oh, thank you so much, Rose, for having me.
It was a very nice podcast. Where can people catch you and follow you? Because you have the podcast, 2 podcasts.
Yeah. So, well, Courage to Create, we put out on Saturn Returns. So that was like a mini series. But yeah, if they want to listen to the podcast, they can find it at Saturn Returns with Caggie, and me on Instagram as Caggie's World.
Thank you, Caggie.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Harvest series. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring interviews to build toward the Harvest Summit this May in Katlankaya. We'll come together to explore the theme of courage.